So, Gio, tell me a little more about yourself. What got you into this? What's the arc of your life?
I am what I've decided to call myself, which is a cult philosopher. And uh, that means that I spend my time thinking about culture, ways of life, human instincts, and how to augment human instincts with culture, meme, thoughts, habits, and the such. One example that I've been using to kind of describe how my internal thought process works when it comes to cultural philosophy. I have been using a lot of because of the pandemic, which is more about like response and building the culture of how to deal with the pandemic is something you do after a pandemic to prepare for the next one. But my preferred example here is one of the great medical innovations that we've had as humans is open air hospice, which developed a significant following during tuberculosis epidemics. And the basic idea here is you put people in a mountain hospital. You have a giant deck with beds, lots of blankets. You keep people warm, but they breathe the crisp, fresh mountain air. And this helps significantly with outcomes. It's not like a complete panacea, but it extends lifespan significantly and has some other benefits. Some people nearly recover. Like it's far better than what the prior standard of care was, which was you had people in a confined space, kind of bedridden. And the reason that people are in a confined space and bedridden at home, where they can spread the disease uh, to loved ones, is that is essentially our instinctual response to getting infected. And the reason that this is our instinctual response to getting infected is that if you imagine a prehistoric human ancestor, say a rodent from 100 million years ago, mammal, not a rodent, but like a rodent-like mammal, gets infected. What is the biggest danger? It's not the infection. It's being out and exposed while weakened. And so that means the basic predators are a bigger threat than the disease, but the threat of the disease is the predators, not the illness itself killing you. Most diseases don't kill you, but they do make you weak for a period of time. And so going home where you know you're safe and where it is warm and where kin can take care of you if you're a social creature, which our ancestors were, then it makes the most sense to go home, go to your nest, curl up in a ball, wait to fight off the disease. This has the negative effect of increasing your viral or disease load. So if you're sick and you're in a confined space, you are rebreathing in the virus that you're expelling, which means that you are getting more infected. An infection lasts longer and it makes it harder to fight it off. So it's more likely you'll die of the disease if you go home to your nest or up in a ball. And it's likely you'll spread that to your loved ones, your kin, and they will get sick and potentially die, which is also bad.
Hmm.
This, however, this frame of selection is de emphasized compared to the frame of selection that is if you stay out in the open, a predator will get you. And so that is how you respond to is, oh, there is a predator threat. I need to curl up in a ball and stay safe somewhere. And so now in the modern world where we don't have these kinds of predators, we need to augment our instinctual response with a cultural model of what to do if you're an infected that increases your survival chances. and that is something like open air hospice, but refined by like an order of magnitude, and then also you bring treatment and other things. But um, that's kind of like a baseline way of thinking. Does this make sense?
Yeah, it's interesting. So what you're saying is times like this could be a way for cultures to prey on people's beliefs in some sense, right? It's both a time for potential cultural transformation, but at the same time, um, you can also have all kinds of cultures preying on people because they are weakened by the virus. They're outside, they're exposed, their minds are exposed, their faith is exposed.
Hmm. That's an interesting way to conceptualize this. Is to re recapture the frame of the predator threat within modern interhuman dynamics, which is another frame that I've been working with in terms of disease from like the cultural philosophy thinking, where there are something like two core responses that people have to disease culturally, instinctually, I should say. One of these responses is sort of a collectivize and share framing, which is like there is an unknown threat on the horizon. Gather with those you trust and your loved ones, your community, your nation, your fellow humans, uh, your planet. If you take that to the biggest perspective, organize yourselves, share in all the good and all the misery equally, and band together to solve problems. That is one response. It's a sort of collectivized moral response. There is another response, which is take the opportunity of the catastrophe that is presented and the damage that that catastrophe does to others and their fitness to leapfrog forward in your position, which is something like a individualize, compete kind of mindset. And so this mindset is others are weakened. I can use this to my advantage. I will take risks that put them at greater risk and even myself at a certain risk on the expectation that I will be able to survive whatever happens and end up on the other side in a better position. This is sort of an extension of the competitive game that was the primary game that everyone was playing before the disease arrived. Now, what's interesting is that there are versions of the competitive game that masquerade as the collectivized game. And this might be something like a open borders message, which would be something like um, it's like let's all share in the misery of the disease kind of message, right? Which resonates with the collectivized mentality of let's share in misery and bounty. But then this message finds ways of curating the bounty that is available in the hands of those who are playing the individualized compete game. Um, and off the top of my head, I can't come up with like exact wording, but let me search through my notes very quickly and find this in where I've written it. Right. Okay. Mm-hmm. You can talk if you want. Sure.
Um, no, I'll wait for you, actually.
Okay. There we go. Found it. Now I just need to find it. Yeah, so what I've written is the individualize, capitalize, or as I was terming it, like compete. Those are kind of the same terminology. Capitalize on the catastrophe, individualize, capitalize, or individualize, compete with those damaged by the catastrophe. Response is part of what is driving the open up and let it burn through thinking. There are people who irrationally accept the misery aspect of collectivize, the virtue signal goodness, their own moral personal goodness, which is in some part a individualized, capitalized frame masquerading as a foe, collectivize unknown, or collectivize like share kind of framing. This breaks collectivized frame. Like what makes it work is that we all work together. If we don't work together or actually secret competing, then it damages everybody's chance of survival and like return to normal, making us all worse off by playing off of a self-sacrifice motif to try and win individually in a continuation of the competitive game which Paramount before the disease struck. And then I added, in a different time of history, I would use the words treasonous to describe people act in this path and speak this way about how to behave. The open up and let it burn through thinking, that is in some sense treasonous in my eyes. And that is sort of what I had written up.
It's interesting. I'm trying to make sense of it.
And I guess I could go into why I
Yeah, why?
became a cultural philosopher, because I think
Yeah.
that's one of my favorite stories. So
Why did you
this,
become a cultural philosopher?
yeah, so this begins in my childhood a little bit.
Uh-huh.
I think that's really it's the life story. So I was homeschooled
Yeah, I
as a kid,
figured.
and so I'm kind of a self-taught autodidact, which is different from being self-taught or an autodidact. Is I taught myself to be an autodidact, which is a self-teacher. Um, you can be taught to teach yourself, but that was not my experience. I had to teach myself to teach myself. And so I was homeschooled, which I found really pretty good for the most part intellectually, because it's a lot of time where you're just yourself with your thoughts and the knowledge. You can go to your parent who is your teacher or to a tutor if you're from a family wealthy enough to have a tutor. And this is how Alexander the Great learned. And there are definitely advantages. Like if you have a good teacher or have good textbooks, then the learning process is very much a powerful one. Um, there are downsides, like the social cost of not building friend relationships nearly as easily because you're not part of the school culture, which is the majority culture. So you have to find ways to bond with other kids, which can also be homeschooled, or it could be from a public school if you play sports. That's what worked for me for the most part, was sports teams, swim team, baseball, soccer. Um, you could go down a list of cross country, track and field, all that kind of stuff I participated in, and that's how I socialized for the most part. And that was good. Without that, I would have been completely lost as an adult. I also learned a lot from like children's TV show, like live action TV shows for kids. Like that's how I learned. Like Hannah Montana was like I watched that as an educational program to understand the social environment that kids worked in.
This is how kids are.
Like how, like, because I kind of had this double life aspect to things, so it made sense to me on like a level that that was a model that I could use to build a social interaction skill set, which maybe wasn't the wisest choice, but that was kind of my childhood. um, so I went to high school my senior year because I was done with the homeschooling process. It just was breaking down, like stress wise, socially. I needed like romance. I needed for relationships, and so high school, I probably should have gone to all 4 years of high school, but I went my senior year. That was really good. I won most spirited in the yearbook in a single year. So that kind of tells you a little bit about my personality and how other people saw me. Um, and it was like really, really good as an experience. The schoolwork thing was a little bit of a challenge because I was not well synced up with their like their timeline. So they were learning stuff in math that I didn't have all the background for, and then there was stuff in math that I had done like years ago and had half forgotten that they were just getting to. So it's like there's a mismatch there. And then in some other classes, there were some mismatches where I knew stuff that nobody else in the class knew, and then they were expected to know stuff that I was unfamiliar with. And so there's some like knowledge dependency problems that made it so that grades wise I was not doing the best in some classes, and then in other classes I was breezing through where everybody else I was setting curves in classes that I had absolutely no business setting curves in, just because the way that I was thinking about that material was far more sophisticated than the other kids in the class. Like a notable example is I was the best student that my 70-year-old environmental science teacher had ever had.
Very cool.
And that was AP environmental science. And it was mostly that the way that I was thinking about environmental issues was heavily informed by my like Catholic parents who were right wing, like kind of traditionalist, obviously as I was homeschooled, and then also had like a deep involvement with like oil in Texas because my dad is from Texas. And so I had this wealth of alternative perspectives on environmental science that was just sort of like dinner table conversation a little bit. And I could leverage that to think about the educational material that we were receiving in a different way. So I could have like 3 or 4 different perspectives on what was being taught. And so I could look at it from the perspective of these are the facts about environmental science. I could look at it from what would an environmentalist say if they were doing environmentalist propaganda, and then I could look at it from, well, what is sort of like the core values of like the oil industry, and in terms of energy and like energy needs and kind of like that side of it. And then I could also look at it from the perspective of like more myself, which is I grew up on, you know, build stuff in the woods as a kid with a hatchet, Boy Scout, you know, play Indians, like cowboys and Indians, and live off the land perspective, that, you know, is kind of like deep ingrained in my soul. And, you know, human as a wild animal kind of perspective, right?
Hmm.
And so I could bring all those perspectives to the material, and that gave me a lot of leverage to not just learn the material but to understand kind of the purpose of the what was being taught. And that put me in a very strong position in terms of understanding the material in a way so that I was the best student that my teacher had ever had. And so that's part of the effect of homeschooling is you min max quite a bit more than everybody else.
Fascinating story, man. Yeah, I was just saying, I always figured homeschooling would definitely make you more creative, would cultivate more inspired kids. Uh, I had never, let me just say, I don't think I have ever met someone who was homeschooled but alone, right? Because I actually have a friend who was homeschooled with 15 of her siblings. So that's different, right? There you have connections and you have a rich inner world. Whereas if you're homeschooled alone, then you really do have to treat pop culture as an educational material. Yeah,
Yeah, I was homeschooled with my sister, but my sister was definitely on a very different track to me. And so she went to like middle school. Uh, like I probably wouldn't have benefited from going to middle school, but high school I would have. Whereas she went to middle school and is a rough process to transition.
from homeschool to middle school.
Yeah, yeah. And she was also like far more social. Um, I was a lot more introverted and self-obsessed is not quite the right word, but in my own head would be a good way to say it. Like I had a lot of imagination as a kid.
Would you homeschool your kids?
I kind of plan on it because my ideal future life is I have like a 40-foot sailboat that's enough for like maybe you could fit 5 people on it and like live that way, but you know that wouldn't be like the optimal number of people on it. And so that's like the size of sailboat that I would want to get, and then I would just travel the world as an author. Like you know, you sail and then you write on your keyboard, and that's how you make money. And then you know, visit everywhere in the world and do that while raising kids. That seems to me like the optimal life plan. Figuring how to pull it off is a little bit of a challenge, but that's kind of what I want to do with my life and versions of that. Like it wouldn't just be like live on a sailboat, but versions of find the maximally generative ways of moving and experiencing the world in terms of like raw bounty of experience, so like the beauty of life, and then also in ways that drive creative thinking and understanding about things that other people do not know and experience and understand. And so like you know, going on a through hike of the Appalachian or Pacific Crest trails is on my bucket list. You know, going on a long multi-month kayak trip is on my bucket list. uh there's a lot of stuff that's my bucket list that is stuff that requires massive time commitments, you know, in single blocks. And the best way to leverage that is to write about it and or video blog it or something like that. And you know, in terms of making money while you're doing the thing that you want to do is the way to go through life. And so figuring out the way to do it, what do you want to do that you can make money off of, is a good question for people to ask themselves. And then how can you make money out of doing what you want to do? And for me, it seems to be experience stuff that is worth experiencing in the, you know, 50 years that I have left, or 30 years that I have left where I'm likely to be physically competent. And what can I do to experience the stuff that is most powerful in life, that I can find ways to share with people in ways that makes money and then also benefits them in terms of their outlook on life. That's what I'm kind of paying attention to, um, and kind of what I want to do. And I don't know if it's really possible to do that while raising kids and without homeschooling them.
Yeah, yeah. I do think kids would need more grounding that what you have in
Mm.
mind. But at the
I
same
agree.
time,
There's problems that need to be solved on that.
yeah, yeah. But at the same time, I do believe that parents have a lot of creative influence over kids, and the human spirit thrives in many strange circumstances. So who knows? Maybe that's a great way to build inspired, grow. I just said grow inspired kids, but yeah, that's basically what it is, right? You're growing a plant
Mhm.
in some sense. You need to tend to it over a long period of time, and at some point, you would recognize that it shapes into a certain being. And I suppose that's the kind of relationship people have with their kids, but I don't have any kids yet.
So you mentioned grounding, and that's an interesting topic, leveraging off of my own homeschooling experience, because I wouldn't describe my homeschooling experience as like ungrounded despite being pretty isolated. And like a big problem with it kind of was the Catholic propaganda, to put it one way. And going out of high school, I was certainly a bit, or more than a bit, confused about life and what to believe, and also quite a bit depressed, which had been a building problem through the high school years and kind of culminated the senior year. And a lot of that depression stuff was not having a clear vision for my life. I think that was a significant factor. And then also social isolation was another aspect of that. Um, not not having a uh, squad, so to speak. I had squad goals. There was no squad for those goals.
Mm.
Um, and so that kind of not having a brother probably was like the core driver of my depression. Having someone who is brother close as another human being, um, I think is very, very important for human psychology, especially male psychology. And I think that was a major factor in my depression. And so out of high school, I was very depressed. I was sent to a youth rehab program in Utah, which was 6 weeks to 8 weeks of hiking through the wilderness with sociopaths, recovering drug addicts, and autistic kids who were rejected by their parents, which is an entire class of kids in these rehab programs. Like my best friend in the program was this autistic Jewish boy whose parents worked for Chase Bank, and who were like executives at Chase Bank, I think, is, if memory serves, and who was the best rapper that I've ever heard in terms of freestyle flow. You could give him any topic and he would flow on it for like 20 minutes straight, rhyming everything while telling a story, like a deep, engaging story. They could give him like bunny rabbits in the field, and we would be walking by and there'd be like bunny rabbits in a field, and he would just start to flow, and he would literally rap Watership Downs or something equally intense, right?
Wow.
And this was like the only thing this kid would do. He wouldn't look you in the eyes. He like stumbled over his speech really bad. He was like very much everything you could imagine like a Jewish autistic boy would be. If you gave him a flow to rap, this kid would crush it. It was insane. Like he was so consistently good, you know? Like telling a story. It wasn't just like rhyming words together that kind of made sense. It was like a interwoven story. Like it was so good. It was crazy. And
Fascinating. So that was his mode of expression.
yeah, that was how he communicated with the world. Was like he needed a recording contract with Dr. Dre. You know what I mean? So that's the kind of people. So you had like drug addicts who were assholes because they were in withdrawals. Then you had sociopaths who were assholes because they're sociopaths. And then you had autistic kids who were super lonely and had no way of like managing human interaction. And so I was like the depressed kid that was a little bit weird. So I kind of ended up in that autistic kids rejected by their parents category. And that was also kind of going on. My like family was very, very strained at the time. And so I got out of that program eventually, nearly walked. I was planning to hitchhike my way back home. And the therapist that I've been working with drove up to me and bribed me into staying through a series of lies, deceptions, and outright bribes, which I'd stayed, but regretted it. Anyways, ended up in another program, which was a residence type program. So we had roommates, and so there are wild stories of that 8 to 12 months of my life. Most of it I spent backpacking through Utah every day, and rock climbing, bouldering mostly because I didn't have a rope, and then some highballing. So I did some climbs that would be fatal if I fell, just kind of for fun because there was nothing else to do. And then I spent the rest of my time writing and listening to music and thinking. And that's kind of where the seeds of cultural philosophy started to zone, because I started like spending so much time alone in the wilderness, by myself, sort of pushing myself to the limit where death and like the taste of risk was in my mouth, and kind of I was like 19, 20, somewhere in there, and you know I was just thinking about life a lot, and thinking about it in ways that most people in the modern world don't end up thinking about life, because they're not in the wilderness on their own. It became a shaman is kind of like without psychedelics, like that was the path, is a hermit or a shaman. And so that was the path that I was on, and eventually got kicked out of the program, became homeless. Had the police kick me awake in my sleeping bag multiple times, and then eventually went to the local homeless shelter, which was radically different than the rehab programs that I'd been in. Rehab programs, everybody's miserable, everybody's a sociopath or a drug addict, recovering drug addict, so they're going through the withdrawals and complete asshole, or like completely socially isolated and like depressed and going through like massive social rejection and like losing touch with their family, like all this like tragedy everywhere, misery everywhere, and everybody is trying to fuck you over. And then at the homeless shelter, every single person was grateful, happy, turning a new page, or had found a path through life that worked for them. Like a lot of the homeless are career homeless, but a lot of those are like decent people who just don't work in the modern world. And so a lot of them are like, they're fun to be around. Like they'll be playing harmonica or like have a little banjo and just be like hanging out and telling jokes and drinking a beer and just having a good time. There was a family there, and so everybody was like obsessed with this like 2-year-old kid, and like everyone's taking care of him and like telling him stories. Like it was a completely different environment. I don't know if this is specific to the homeless shelter that I was in Utah, which is kind of a small town, and like there was some stuff that was rather unique about it, but as an experience it was incredible. Like there was so much optimism there. And then from there I pivoted to Job Corps and went to a computer repair and programming classroom at Job Corps. And Job Corps is kind of like a college campus or high school. It's a trade campus. Yeah.
Mhm.
So it's a trade school campus that is run like a prison compound. And
Wow.
so it's
How
a
long were you in
it's
the
a
homeless
little
shelter?
bit what?
How long were you in the homeless shelter?
Oh, 90 days.
Okay.
And like that was a really transformative experience, and that
I can imagine.
like that was eye-opening in terms of happiness has nothing to do with money.
Yeah.
It has everything to do with community. And that was a like really deep lesson that I learned there. I'd been learning it, but like to have it that stark, to have all these rich kids, because to be in one of these programs it's not cheap, and almost everyone there was probably richer than I was. um I had kids, son, like children of celebrities, bastard childs of celebrities, especially. And then, kids who were wealthy enough to be addicted to heroin and cocaine, which, like the good stuff versions of those drugs, and, who like got it out of daddy's back pocket. And then also like who are rich enough to be sociopaths who are caught and then sent to this kind of a program. There were lots of like, there were kids of governors, there were kids of celebrities, there were kids of millionaires. That was kind of that crew, and every single one of these kids was pretty much miserable. And then the homeless shelter, nobody has $2. People are like taking day jobs. You go to Home Depot and hang out there with uh, the day laborers. You learn some Spanish, and you shovel gravel for a couple hours. You carry boxes from a garage into the back of a truck. You carry stuff from the back of a truck into a garage. You do garden work. You do whatever people pay you $10 an hour for. And that was kind of what people did. You did that to buy some beer. You did that to buy some additional food than what was fed at the homeless shelter. You did that to buy a gift for the kid. you know um and so it was just like you were just hanging out and having a grand old time most of the time. There were rules you had to follow, and some of it was kind of obnoxious at the homeless shelter, but it was nothing like the rehab program. And then Job Corps, on the other hand, was like a bunch of inner city kids who are alone for the first time and to turn around their lives. A lot of them have a criminal past of some kind. It's in juvie. It's now under wraps, but the reason they're at Job Corps is to satisfy kind of the hammer and bench from the judge, which says you do this program and you don't get any jail time. And then there was a bunch of just people who kind of found their way to Job Corps through various pathways. Like there were a lot of poor kids there. There were a lot of kids who, broken families trying to find a way out. That was a lot of the people there. And a lot of it's like training to be an electrician, training to be a car mechanic, training like sort of women's skills, because like a third of the population or more was female. So there's a lot of like learn how to use Excel, Word, spreadsheet, learn how to use computer, secretary skills. There was also um, and then there was like women doing electrician jobs. Like there was a bunch of people trying to find an opportunity that was a small opportunity, but it was the only opportunity, and that made it a very big opportunity. And so there's a lot of people under a lot of stress, like young, like 18 to 25, under a lot of stress.
Yeah.
And then kind of lockdown. There's a fence all the way around of it. There's a gate where you have to have an ID card to go in and out. There's only short periods of time, like a 2-hour window or 3-hour window that you can go out. It's like a half a mile to walk to the nearest McDonald's, which is the only place with like Wi-Fi. And like pretty much the only thing you could do was buy energy drinks and beer if you were old enough at the local 7-Eleven.
Wow. What a life. It sounds like everyone was in some sense finding a crack into society and holding
Yeah,
on to it so that there'll be a larger structure they're a part of as against being afloat on their own.
yeah. And so there was some people, like there was a number of kids who were from Africa. Like let's see, uh, um, that's right behind me. Why am I even trying to think about this? Ethiopia and Nigeria, I remember. Um, so like this one Nigerian kid became like my best friend, and he spoke like 5 languages, right? Um, and he was at Job Corps because he like found a way into the U.S. and was out trying to get a CompTIA computer repair certificate so that he would have a entry level tech job, so that he could build a social network in the US that involved like tech people, so that he could become a computer programmer. Right? That was his plan. And that was kind of my plan too. Like, is I wanted to go into programming. So we had like this curriculum that we had to follow, and both of us could, either of us bang out whatever we had done in that day's curriculum in like 2 hours, and it was like an 8-hour class time. And the rest of the time we spent reading programming manuals, like C plus and C and like C sharp, or JavaScript, Java. which is basically it's kind of like the same syntax as C. Same with JavaScript really. So it was kind of like that side. Maybe a little bit of Python, and then I spent a lot of time reading about Unix. Um, so I was reading a lot about the old school open source software philosophy movement, um, and kind of like the early that came out of Bell, AT&T, and became like the first programmers as a movement, hackers as a like movement. And so that was kind of where I cut my teeth software wise. And then I started looking at college, went to college for a semester, and after I graduated this thing and went back home and kind of got readopted by my family, took kind of a job using my certification, and then was at college and very quickly realized that college was not a good use of time or money. And then had this epiphany where I'd been like open source software world, right? And then I had this epiphany about what everybody was actually doing with computers and cell phones, especially, was we're just addicting ourselves to screens.
Yeah.
That's all we're doing. We're not changing the world. We're not saving the world. We're not doing anything deep or interesting. This magnificent technology. We're addicting ourselves to screens. We're creating dopamine reward circuits, and it's basically like your phone is cocaine. It's completely broken. And so I lost all faith in technology because we don't have the wisdom to use technology to save ourselves as a species. And that's when I became a cultural philosopher. So I essentially wandered off into the wilderness, local. So instead of Utah, I was Washington State, giant trees. Took a road trip through California with my sister. Saw the sequoias and the redwoods, like mind blowing. Sequoias are mind blowing trees. Like we were driving up a hill towards the Sequoia National Park, and there was a sequoia, and I literally didn't believe my eyes when I saw it. It looked like an upside down ice cream cone that was 150 feet tall.
Wow.
Just, it does not look like anything you would imagine a tree looking like. And we looked at it, and I had like a spiritual moment. And so we were like sitting there looking at these sequoia trees. And my sister turns to me and she's like, "Hey, did you know that I'm an atheist?" And the first thought that popped into my head was, wow, so that's what I am. Like I didn't have I knew what the word atheist was, but I didn't have a word for where I was at, like in a spiritual sense. And she said this to me and was like, gave me permission to use that word kind of thing, because being raised Catholic around a bunch of homeschooled Catholic kids where half the people believe the earth is 6,000 years old is a weird environment to kind of gird your fundamental beliefs about reality. And so I was just sitting there among these magnificent ancient, like multiple thousands of year old trees that are just beautiful and wild and like so bizarre, as like they look so bizarre, they look alien, and they're gigantic. Like you walk up to one and it's like walking up to a small house at the base. It's massive. And then you look up and the thing's so fat. Like, it's like 30 feet around or 40 feet around, and then like 150 feet tall. It looks like this, you know? And so just like spiritual experience on top of spiritual experience. And I was just there. I was experiencing like the magnificence of nature and kind of thinking about the meaning of life and like what is true about reality. And that was kind of like a sea change moment for where I was at in the world. And so I kind of started studying like deep science and like atheism and the like pinnacle achievements of modernity in terms of intellectual achievements of modernity. So game theory, uh biology, like true biology, not like the fake stuff that is super watered down, but the horrifying nightmare fuel side of biology that also contains within it like the like glittering seeds of truth that might sh- present a path forward to save humanity. And just learning, then like sort of the peak of modern philosophy, and sort of Sam Harris style thinking, and then so emergence theory, and Alan Watts and Jordan Peterson, and that that realm of thinkers, philosophers, speakers. And that's kind of that was my gestalt that I grew my thinking out of.
It's a fascinating story, man. I didn't know this was the extent of it. Um, it does also explain a lot of how your views end up being so distinct. And yeah, overall, spirited is a great way to describe what you bring to our initiatives. So yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.